Hi, Florence Theriault here. I want to tell you this auction that I'm about to talk to you about. This auction is personal for me. Sometime in the late 1980s, I don't remember the exact time or place or the circumstances, my husband George and I met Marianne and Jürgen Cieslik. It was simpatico from the start. We knew no German except Danke and Guten Morgen, and Jürgen struggled with English. Marianne saved us all because she had learned English from British television, so she told me. And so we cobbled along, all of us, with our broken language because we felt this simpatico from the start. And remember, there was no Google Translate at this time either. But adventure, laughter, and the common interest of dolls saved the day. The Ciesliks uncovered Germany for us. They showed us all the historic places where doll magic had been made, and they introduced us to the remaining families of these doll makers. They shared their home with us, their meals, their archives. They saw fit to reprimand us, only walk on the crosswalks and never walk against the light, which seemed kind of silly to us because we were in a town of about 50 people and absolutely no traffic, but that was the rule. And asked Marianne in so many words one morning, "Why are you sweeping the sidewalk in front of your house in this little village?" And she looked at me and said, "Doesn't everyone? Because evidently that's what you do in Germany." It was our introduction to a different culture, a different way of life, and to dolls in their native habitat. I'm so proud and so fortunate to be able to share with you their collection. I'm going to show you some of the things that they have contributed to the doll world in those years from the 1980s until now. And they're now moving to smaller quarters, and so they have been obliged to share their collection with you. And I'm very privileged to be honored to be the one to present it in our catalog, and it will be in our auction form. And in doing this, I've made references to many of the places in their various books where you can find reference. They did, for example, they did this wonderful The Teddy Bear Encyclopedia. But even before they did that, they centered on the firm of Steiff, and they did the Steiff Encyclopedia, which is an absolutely extraordinary work of research based from the original archives, not just photographs and casual things, but registration marks and historical information that's so valuable. And then, of course, their extraordinary, published in the 1980s, German Doll Encyclopedia. This was the first work of its kind to really take all of the really important historical information that they had been able to gather from the archives in Germany. And I'm going to be talking more about this as we go along and tell you a little bit about what they underwent to get this research. But it's published in this wonderful encyclopedia back in the 1980s, long out of print. If you can get a hold of a copy of it, I urge you to do so. It is invaluable. You will never find anything like it. And then later, they published their magazine, the Puppen magazine, in German. And I was so frustrated because every month would come out these wonderful articles that I wanted to read and didn't read German. So I convinced them, let's do a book, and we'll pick out some articles that are really fascinating, original research, and we worked with them, and together we published the German Doll Studies, which were articles from their original magazine. They did many more books in this, including reprints of important catalogs of manufacturers, including Marianne's Dollhouse Encyclopedia, so many, many wonderful things. Well, I wanted to talk to you about what they went through to do this research. And I wrote an article for Antique Doll Collector, and in the beginning of the article, this is kind of what I said, and it sums it up. It was 1982, and it would be another 7 years before the Great Wall separating East and West Germany came down. For West German doll researchers, this presented an almost unsurmountable task. After all, the most famous of the German historic doll factories were over there in East Germany, and you couldn't go over there. There was a wall, you couldn't get in, or you could get in, but there was so much bureaucracy and so much paperwork to fill out. And as I learned, once you got over there, you were under constant surveillance, and it was a dangerous time at all time. And plus, you better bring your own toilet paper, or you would have a problem. So But they persisted in doing this, and they were able to get in touch with many of these old original families that were living there, and many of them had maintained and kept their archives and their files and even some of the treasures that they still had. And I'm going to tell you a story about the two dolls right here. And this is actually what they wrote in this book, German Doll Studies, which was originally an article published in their Puppen magazine. In their premier issue of Puppen magazine, they wrote the story about these dolls. And this is in their writing, so I'm going to read it to you in English. It was a dark evening. The streets of Sonnenberg were empty, which was usual. We visited a house on Riechenstrasse 18, where we were expected by Walter Roth, the son of Victor Roth, the last owner of the Emil Bowersox doll factory. Walter Roth was a lively little man who lived alone in the basement of this house. I was in East Germany when it was still East Germany, and I want to tell you, it was glum. There were no people on the streets. This was not a festive time. It was dark, it was gloomy, and they capture it so perfectly here. He gave us a hearty welcome, however. He lived alone in the basement of this house. He gave us a hearty welcome and led us past many locked doors to the last room in the corridor, which was his living room. His stove in this living room was as unforgettable as Walter Roth was. It was located directly near the door of this overstuffed room, green, high, tiled stove, which gave a tremendous heat despite its visible signs of decay, which is a little scary when you think about it. The fire bricks had crumbled over the years and were glowing so hot that the wall of the living room behind the oven was also burned black and glowing. And the evening went on. As the evening went on, we took off our jackets and sweaters. Ties were loosened, shirt collars open, and sleeves rolled up. Only Walter Roth seemed not to be disturbed by the heat. So the interview with this gentleman went on. At first, he was very suspicious at first, and he was wondering, why are you coming in here, and what do you want to know? But as it went on, he became really intrigued with what they were doing in their research. And as they say, sometimes when we were talking about doll types in production, Walter Roth suddenly jumped up, excused himself for a short time, and returned either with a doll or a document from old times. After showing these treasures to us, they disappeared as fast as they had appeared. Walter Roth died shortly after the wall fell down, and the apartment was emptied. There were no relatives, and all of the Bowersox documents, I get chills, I'm getting chills just talking about it now. All of these treasures and documents and papers that he had seemed to disappear until one day they were contacted by a member of the family who still had retained this original doll. This is one of the last dolls that had been made. This is a really important doll. The doll was made in 1913, and if you think it looks like a Gebruder Heubach and not an Emil Bowersox, that's because the head was poured in the Gebruder Heubach firm. The head was made by Gebruder Heubach, but it was made for Emil Bowersox. And what is the doll wearing? It's wearing their version, a simplified version of the style of 1813. And this was now 1913, 100 years later. In 1813, Napoleon had been ousted from Germany, sent back to France, and the Germans were now celebrating the 100 years later when they got the French out of their country. And in honor of that, Emil Bowersox had this doll created wearing this empire style dress. This is the original bonnet, the original dress. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary find. A rare model in itself, but having the history and the original costume makes it a really, really fine doll. Over the years, the Cieslicks managed to find another copy of the doll. This one is an all composition body, and this one has the kid body, but two really rare examples of the Emil Bowersox. I wondered at the time, it was, I never can understand. I always like to know how things fit into the social context or historic context of their time. So, okay, so you're celebrating getting Napoleon out of your country. I get that. It's 100 years later. It's a centennial of your victory. But it was shortly after that that Germany invaded France. And I'm thinking, Emil Bowersox's main market was France. Why would he have made this doll to sell to France? So who did he make it for? Did he have it? Was it a special commission? Was it a special celebration that he was doing? Did he have a different market for it than France? Things always to be discovered, things still to be looked upon and researched, and things that make the actual object itself, this beautiful, beautiful doll, perfectly preserved, make it even more intriguing and fascinating because it carries this story and this legacy with it, which is a wonderful piece. And this is what the Seaslicks were all about. In doing their research, one of the things that we used to say all the time in our early years was, and we've taken it as the title of this particular auction we're talking about, is that knowledge is the only elegance. And this was taken from Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of his lectures that he did in the mid-1800s. And he talked about knowledge being the only elegance. And to me, that was such an appropriate phrase for doll collecting, because we go in, we look for a doll, and right away what we look for is we look for its beauty, we look for its costume, we look for its presentation, we look for its elegance. And yet what really gives that doll depth, what really gives it its beauty and its passion and its elegance, is knowledge about that doll. And so it seemed to, working with the collectors whose works encompass this catalog, and I'll be talking to you more about some of the others, that seemed very, very appropriate, that knowledge is the only elegance. So that wonderful doll from them. I have other dolls from the Seaslicks collection here on the table that I think are kind of, well, they bring their stories with them, and that's why I love them in particular. And here we have Hans, or is it Carlo? And that's the story. The Seaslicks, during their early years in doing their magazine, were contacted by the family of Franz Reinhardt of Cameron Reinhardt, of Franz Reinhardt, and said, oh, by the way, we have some family documents and a doll and some photographs that you might be interested in for your magazine. Well, I guess you know that they were. So they made a visit to go down and visit, and the person they were visiting was Carlo Geisig. Carlo Geisig was the grandson of Franz Reinhardt, and more than that, Carlo Geisig was Hans. He was the model for this doll when it was first designed, and he was just basically an infant when it started. By the time the doll came out, he was 2 or 3 years old. And what came from the family was, well, Carlo said, Carlo was now, so this would have been like in the 1980s, and Carlo was in his 60s, I believe, and he would have been older than that. But anyway, he'd taken an interest in, believe it or not, sports airplanes. And in order to have an interest in the expensive hobby of sport airplanes, I guess you have to sell some of the family treasures. And that's why the Seaslicks were able to obtain some of these treasures, because Carlo wanted to go into sport airplanes. We're grateful it just didn't get everything thrown in the shuffle. Anyway, here is the family. This belonged to the original family, stayed in the family all of those decades from the time it was made until acquired by the Seaslicks in 1980. So there have been basically the family owner and the Seaslick that owned this version of Hans, coming from them with his original costume, boots. And here is an original watercolor that came from the family showing him posed, and you can see that it is a wonderful rendition. But even more, there are 2 albums that are filled with family photographs, and I want to move him a little bit so I can show you some of these, because I think when you flip through these pages you will see how absolutely intriguing. There's all him as a little boy, there he is as a child. That one fell out, and then there's more, and it goes on, and there he is, and these are all Carlo during his early years. And then there's images later, and here he is, 2 little photographs right here. And then toward the end, they start showing these family outings, which are wonderful. And somewhere along the time, so if you know automobiles, you'll know more than I will, the family has an automobile. And then you start to see their excursions in the automobile, here and here, until my favorite photograph of this entire thing, the last page, where there was a flat tire. And a couple people are trying to fix it, and the rest of them are standing around saying, no, do it this way, do it that way, oh, what shall we do, will it ever get fixed? And it just seemed like some things in life never change. But this is an opportunity to own a doll with an extraordinary provenance, and we are so, so fortunate to be able to offer that to you today. Here's the original photograph, and then the family had a watercolor made of it, which they had hanging over their mantle. Absolutely wonderful, wonderful piece. And I wanted to make sure I told you everything about that I wanted to. They actually, during their first visit to the family, that's when they found out, and the family had never known this either, but they were able to see different papers and documents and a bust, and the name Professor Lewin Funk kind of came into the conversation. And from that, the Cieslicks started doing research, and that's when they found out that the artist, Lewin Funk, whose name has now become very, very known as one of the sculptors of German dolls, was the original sculptor of the first model from the Cameron Reinhardt art character series. What is interesting about this, again, this is one more example of an artist who's a fine artist, in quotes, in his field, sculptures, painting, this type of thing, who had such an impeccable reputation in art circles that there was a little hesitancy of him being known as he designs dolls. That's kind of too commercial. So very often their names have remained clouded to us, and to find out who another one of them was, that was a big discovery and an important gift that the Cieslicks gave us. Knowledge is the only elegance, and the elegance of this couple is made more evident by the knowledge we obtained for him. Johann Franz, not a name that many of you know, but Johann Franz, and Marianne wrote a wonderful article about him that appears in the German Doll Studies. You can see how well I use my book. Look, it's well used. She did an important article about the Johann Franz company because their specialty was not making dolls. Their specialty was making doll costumes. Remember, this was during the 1880s and into the early 1890s, and Germany was trying to compete against France for the world doll market. And one of the ways they wanted to compete was in their costuming. Well, I think they realized they couldn't quite grasp, they couldn't get that luxury that the French had, or maybe the French just had this reputation and they weren't going to compete against it. But they could make really quality, beautiful costumes and make them look so French-like that the cost would be less and people would buy them. And that was what Johann Franz did. It was a specialty of his company. But he had this one thing he did differently, and he actually registered this doll. It's called the Dancing Couple. And if you look under her skirt, there is the little box in which there is a music box and a separate key for turning, and then they twirl around on the wheeled base that is hidden beneath her skirt. Now, we've seen this in France as well. We've seen this earlier with Theriault, and then we see it moving into Vichy did a pair of the waltzing couple, and this was a set done by Johann Franz in Germany. And according to the Cieslicks article, now again, this was written in 1980, or 85, so something may have been discovered since that time, but at that time, there was no other example known to exist of this particular doll, so it might have been a special commission. Now, this great guy, take a look at him. He is absolutely wonderful. This is a teddy bear by, who do you think? No, not Steiff. This is a teddy bear by Theodor Strunz. And Theodor Strunz began making his teddy bears really about the same time Steiff did. This wonderful 31-inch teddy bear was made in 1909, presented by the Theodor Strunz company, and with this bear we have an original catalog from the company which shows the bear, and he was described in this catalog as a polar bear who is a clown, which is curious, but that's okay, it works, and it's really great. He's all originally in beautiful condition except for some fading of the felt and the flannel work along on his arms, but his mohair is wonderful. And Jürgen gave the background story because I'd often ask him, this bear sat in a shaded corner of their living room for so many years because they were so proud of it. And I said, well, where did you get this? Where did you get this? And he had tracked down the story, and this is what they wrote about. It's in the book Teddy Bear Encyclopedia, which I think is important to you because many of you who might end up wanting to bid or buy on these dolls, to know that these stories appear in print form and help document your item, your object, and give it added value. So that's really important. But in Teddy Bear Encyclopedia, he said, Jester spent its life as a teddy bear down in the teddy bear clown in the very north of England, in Scotland. Somewhere in a little cottage it survived, perhaps completely forgotten, until discovered by the heirs of the former cottage owner in 1991. So I can't do the math, 1991 from 1909. It was in this little cottage, kind of hidden away, thankfully, and no mice got it and no one got it. It was well preserved. And then the heirs found it and they sent it to London where it went for auction. And Jurgen was able to acquire this Jester bear, which he dearly loved, and it became almost like a motto of all of his work that he was doing. And they have had it in their possession now for almost 30 years. So again, two owners, the original owner and then the Cieslicks. Not only wonderful because you have the whole history of it, but it is so rare. There's no other example in this size known to exist. A great rarity in teddy bears. And then just a couple other things to show you on this table, because I know I've just gone on and on. I have put this wonderful little pair of ducks by Fleischmann and Blodell here on the front to show you, because they were the mascots of the Teddy Bear magazine for so many years. We have a wonderful, yes, you know her, Mama Katzenjammer, in beautiful condition, done by the Steiff firm, and she was a tea cozy. Beautifully, beautifully preserved. And then, in the sense of knowledge is the only elegance, this is the German Elegance. And I say, for doll collectors who say there's no opportunity for me in dolls anymore, this is your opportunity. The German fashion dolls being made the very same time as the French fashion dolls, known as Staatdamen, Staat-Damen. And that was the German fashion doll. And the costumes that they come in, and I've never seen one in this size. It's just impeccably preserved. It is absolutely wonderful. Look at that. Even her fancy little painted boots with the gilt paper edging. So we're going to now do a speedier. I had a big introduction, but now we're going to try to do a speedier visit to many of the other exciting dolls coming up in this auction.